We have just been told that in Gethsemane, Jesus fell to the ground and prayed to be somehow allowed to avoid what he was facing. We are told this in the third person, but now the very words that Jesus prayed are reported to us. In Gethsemane, we are standing on holy ground. Every word of God is pure. So let's listen in on these words from the very heart of the Saviour.
Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will.
Jesus was praying for a long time, and although they slept through most of it, at least one of the three disciples nearest to him heard parts of his prayer. These disciples didn't report his entire prayer word for word. Instead, they reported what stuck in their memories. They remembered what they thought was most remarkable. One of the things about Jesus' prayer that most stuck in their minds was the name he used for God. Jesus addresses his Father with the name Abba. This is an Aramaic word which is best translated as Daddy. It indicates a relationship of deep and intimate trust. The disciples were always very impressed with how Jesus prayed. That's why they asked him to teach them to pray. Notice then the pattern of this prayer. First of all, Jesus acknowledges who God is. He is Abba, his Father. Then, Jesus acknowledges his Father's sovereign power. Everything is possible for you. Then, Jesus makes his request. Take this cup from me. Finally, Jesus submits himself entirely to God the Father. Not what I will, but what you will. Compare that pattern with how you usually pray. What can you learn from the prayer of Jesus? What can you do differently? Jesus has been praying in anguish of heart, but he hasn't forgotten his disciples. He's worried for them because he knows what will happen. And also, he hopes to be able to draw strength from them. So he goes back to see how they are doing. He's about to be bitterly disappointed.
Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
As much as Jesus is distressed, he has not forgotten his disciples, and he goes back to where he left Peter, James, and John. In what Jesus says to the three, we often see a rebuke, imagining that his words were spoken with an angry tone. We need to learn to see Jesus in a different light. Certainly his words conveyed his disappointment, but they were spoken in love. Christ's concern is their lack of preparation for the coming trial that they are about to face. When Jesus says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, he isn't excusing Peter, James, and John. He's merely stating a fact. Just an hour or so back, they had all said that they would never abandon him, even if they had to die with him. And now, when Jesus has asked them to do a simple thing, just to stay awake, they can't do it. It's often the simple things that trip us up, isn't it? But what this passage tells us is that Jesus understands. He understands not just your spirit, but he also understands your flesh. What is it that usually makes you stumble? There's always something. But if you trust Jesus and stay close to him, he is able to save. Jesus has just been bitterly disappointed to find his disciples sleeping instead of praying. This disappointment is both for their sakes and for his, because he can barely deal with the anguish and temptation that he is facing. So now, Christ has gone away to continue praying for strength again.
Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping, because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him.
I want you to notice that Jesus went away and prayed the same thing. Sometimes I've wondered why we often pray for the same things over and over again. Wouldn't once be enough? After all, God hears and he knows what we need, doesn't he? But even Jesus had to pray the same thing. This tells us that the purpose of prayer isn't just for God to hear. He always hears us. The purpose of prayer is also for us to wrestle in our humanity, so that as God fills us, we may learn to trust and to see as God sees and to do his will. That's how Jesus prayed. When Jesus returned and found Peter, James, and John sleeping yet again, notice that Mark says that they did not know what to say to him. Have you ever found yourself in this same situation, where you found yourself in repeated disobedience and you have no excuses left to make? Perhaps this is your experience today. It's a terrible thing to go through. But Jesus had not cast them out. They were still his disciples whom he loved. So set aside a special time today to be with Jesus. Do not be silent before him. Confess your stumbling and sin and experience his love. 3 times Jesus went to pray alone, and 3 times he returned. And every time he found his disciples, who should have been watching and praying, instead sleeping and resting. And now they were out of time. The hour had come.
Returning the 3rd time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer."
It wasn't time to sleep and rest. The time of Jesus' betrayal had come. The darkest hour of this world's history was upon them. They were resting when they should have been watching, and sleeping when they should have been awake. Notice that it is Jesus who first discerns the approach of the mob. The disciples are too bleary-eyed to notice. Jesus tells them first to rise because they are lying on the ground, and then he says, "Let us go." The question is, go where? I believe that Jesus was hoping that they would follow him after his arrest. The interesting thing is that Jesus had already told them that they would abandon him, so he knew what would happen. However, he is still hoping that they will remain with him as a comfort in his sufferings. This is an interesting example of how the foreknowledge of God never determines his actions and relationships with us. It is also a wonderful example of how Jesus always expects the best from us, seeing the best version of ourselves all the way until the end. Have you ever been driving your car at night and fallen asleep at the wheel? That's what happens when you're trying to stay awake, but you can't, and so you momentarily fall asleep. It's called a microsleep, and it's always terrifying and often deadly. Have you ever ended up suffering because of having been asleep in your life when you should have been awake? Think through that specific situation in your own life. What should you have done differently? And how can you apply that to your spiritual life? At Gethsemane, Jesus has just announced that the hour has come and that the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. He has just told his disciples to get up because the betrayer has arrived. And at that very moment, Judas arrives leading a large armed mob.
Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders.
Judas appears at the head of the mob. He is the one who is leading the way. The people who come to arrest Jesus are a rabble. There are soldiers there with swords. These are likely part of the temple guard under the authority of the high priest. Together with them, there are people who have brought along clubs in order to be part of the action. Mark mentions that the crowd was sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. The chief priests were Sadducees, and they were in charge of the temple in Jerusalem. The teachers of the law were the theologians of their religion. The elders sat on the 71-seat Sanhedrin, the supreme council and court of the Jewish people. I wonder if the people in this mob were proud of themselves. After all, they were obeying their leaders and they were doing their religious duty. Now, think back on your own life. Is there something that today you regret doing in church or in relation to your faith? Particularly if you thought you were doing the right thing at the time. Discuss what happened with a close Christian friend. What can you learn from that experience? The armed mob has just arrived to arrest Jesus. Judas is at their head. Let's look at what happens next.
Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him.
In Middle Eastern cultures now, as in the time of Jesus, men express friendship and affection in more physical ways than in Western cultures. For example, at the Last Supper, we are told that the Apostle John, whom Jesus loved, was leaning against Jesus. This affection between men could also be expressed through hand-holding, embracing, and kissing on the cheek. It is interesting that Judas had prearranged to kiss Jesus as a signal to the mob. This tells us two things. The first thing it tells us is that Jesus didn't stand out in any way in terms of his physical appearance. He looked just like the average first-century Jewish man. The Bible translation, The Message, paraphrases Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 2 like this: "There was nothing attractive about him, nothing to cause us to take a second look." When the Son of Man walked the earth, there was nothing special about his appearance at all. What was special was who he was and what he did. Judas' kiss suggests that in his own mind, his betrayal of Jesus wasn't malicious. Somehow Judas thought that he was helping Jesus along, or even doing him a favor. He felt comfortable enough to walk up to Jesus and kiss him. How misguided he was. Can you think in your life of a time when you thought you were doing Jesus a favor and then you discovered that he didn't really need your help? Share your experience with a friend for your mutual encouragement. The mob has just seized Jesus and arrested him. The disciples are stunned, not knowing what to do. But now, events take an even more dramatic turn.
Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear.
The Gospel of John tells us that it was Peter who cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. The traditional understanding is that the Gospel of Mark is substantially based on the recollections of Peter. Peter told Mark what he remembered, and Mark wrote this down together with what he remembered of Jesus as a young man. This would explain why the Gospel of Mark avoids mentioning Peter's name in this embarrassing episode. The Gospel of John also tells us the name of the man who lost his ear, Malchus. As the servant of the high priest, he would probably have been the leader of the mob. The injury must have been much more severe than just the loss of an ear, and the position of the injury meant that Peter was trying to take his head off. Fortunately, Peter was a much better fisherman than a fighter. Once again, we see Peter getting in the way of God. He does it for all the right reasons. It's because Peter always knows best. Have you ever, metaphorically, whipped out your sword to defend Jesus and made a mess of things? That's what happens when your heart isn't attuned to His. Is there someone you know whose heart is attuned to the heart of Jesus? Make a time to meet with that person, talk about Christ, and see what you can learn. In Gethsemane, Peter has just taken out his sword and attacked the servant of the high priest. And as blood flows, there is uproar. As usual, it is Jesus who takes control.
Am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled.
Notice that in the Gospel of Mark, instead of speaking to Peter, Jesus addresses his words to the mob. Now, to understand what he meant when he asked, "Am I leading a rebellion that you come out with swords and clubs to capture me?" you have to understand something of the environment in which the Jews were living at the time. It was a time of great political and religious upheaval. Every few years, the Romans had to put down rebellions and uprisings. Quite a few of these were led by self-proclaimed messiahs who had both political and religious agenda. Jesus points out that he isn't leading an armed rebellion of the kind that they were used to. His kingdom was of an entirely different sort. Jesus also points out the hypocrisy of the Jewish leaders in not arresting him when he was teaching publicly in the temple courts, because they didn't want to upset the people during the Passover. If Jesus doesn't come to you with swords and clubs, then how does he come to you? Well, he comes to you with gentle words and loving deeds. He comes to you with understanding and mercy to bind your wounds. Think about your life and how Jesus has come to you in the past. Think of one special experience and write it down. Share it with a friend, or if you are brave enough, on social media. Jesus has just been arrested in Gethsemane. Peter has made a futile gesture of defiance by attacking the servant of the high priest with his sword. However, instead of supporting Peter, Jesus makes it clear that he isn't going to resist. How will the disciples react now?
Then everyone deserted him and fled.
It must have been a shocking and terrifying event for the disciples. They'd been peacefully sleeping, and suddenly their rest was interrupted by the torchlight and the sounds of an angry mob. The flight or fight reflex took over, and the flight reflex won. Jesus didn't want his disciples to fight for him with swords or clubs. He wanted them to fight for him by staying as close to him as possible. This was his hour of need, and Jesus needed them. Despite the horror of it all, what a blessing it would have been if they'd all been with John and witnessed the most important moment, not just of their lives, but of all history. What a blessing it would have been for them to have heard the words of Jesus from the cross. But they all deserted him and fled. And no wonder, it could be them next. All of the disciples had insisted that even if they had to die with him, they would never abandon Jesus. Yet they all did. Reflect on your life. Have you ever had some experience in this area? What is the best advice you could give a young Christian who is tempted to abandon Jesus? In Gethsemane, the disciples are all fleeing, abandoning Jesus to his fate. And now we find one of the oddest episodes in the Gospel of Mark.
A young man, wearing nothing but a linen garment, was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind.
The Gospel of Mark is traditionally believed to be the recollection of the Apostle Peter, who as an old man told Mark the story of Jesus, and Mark wrote it down. However, many believe that Mark, as a young man, was also himself an eyewitness to many of the events in Jesus' ministry. If so, then this strange episode makes sense, because this young man could well have been none other than the author Mark himself. And he chose to include this embarrassing episode to call attention to his own cowardice in the face of the bravery of Jesus. The reason why Mark fled basically in his underwear isn't clear. It could have been because he had taken his clothes off to sleep, and that the mob had caught him by surprise. Or perhaps the mob had actually gone to grab some of Jesus' followers, and in the tussle, they'd been left holding on to the young man's clothes while he made his getaway. Whatever happened, it wasn't Mark's most glorious moment. Are there episodes in your life with Jesus of which you're not entirely proud? Do you laugh when you remember them, or do you cringe in shame? If Mark were writing about your story with Jesus, what do you think he would include, and what would he leave out? After Jesus was arrested, he was taken by the mob back down the Kidron Valley and then up into the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. All of Jesus' disciples had abandoned him, but one of them decided to follow the mob at a distance.
They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire.
Archaeologists have identified the house of Caiaphas. It was just below Jerusalem on the slopes of Mount Zion. Jesus would have been marched down the slope of the Mount of Olives, down into the Kidron Valley, and then up the hill again to the house of Caiaphas. By Jewish law, the Sanhedrin was not permitted to meet at night. In a literal sense, the Supreme Court of the Jews wasn't meant to be engaged in works of darkness. However, in their desperation to be rid of Jesus before the solemnities of the Passover sacrifice, the high priest and the chief priests convened an extraordinary nighttime meeting. Peter was there also, the only one of the disciples who had followed the mob. He sat around the fire in the courtyard, from where he could hear what was happening inside. Mark says that Peter followed Jesus at a distance. It's because he had been following Jesus at a distance that he had denied his Lord. How closely are you following Jesus in your life? Jesus is now on trial for his life before the high priest and the Sanhedrin. Christ's enemies have found many witnesses against him, and the Sanhedrin listened to what they had to say.
The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree.
Mark tells us that Jesus was tried by the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin was made up of 71 of the most important religious leaders of the Jews. It was the supreme court of the Jewish people. It was dominated by the Sadducean party, but also included prominent Pharisees. The high priest, in whose house they were meeting, was a Sadducee, as were the other chief priests in Jerusalem. They wanted to have Jesus killed as soon as possible, and so they met at night, which was against the law. The reason why we know what happened at this trial is because Peter, who was sitting around the fire in the courtyard, was able to overhear what was happening inside. At this trial, Mark tells us that many people were brought out who testified falsely against Jesus, but their statements didn't agree. In the same way, there are many who testify falsely about God today. They present a false Jesus, or even deny that God exists. However, just like back then, what they say doesn't stand up to the scrutiny of reason. It's always more logical to speak for Jesus than against him. Now, take a pen and paper or your computer and make a list of all the ways that you can think of in which a person could testify falsely about Jesus. You might need to think carefully about this before you write anything. When you've finished, look at your list. Of how many have you been guilty? During Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin, many witnesses have testified against him. But as is always the case, evil can never agree even within itself, and the witnesses all contradicted each other. Eventually, his enemies brought out their key accusation against Jesus.
Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another, not made with hands." Yet even then, their testimony did not agree.
It is very significant that the most common accusation brought against Jesus in the Gospels is that he had said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. He was also mocked with this at the cross. According to the Gospel of John chapter 2, this is based on Christ's first statement of his public ministry, and the people who heard it never forgot it. Why was this important? Because the evidence from the Bible and from history tells us that the Jews were expecting to identify the Messiah when he came, because he would cleanse and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And this is what Jesus had claimed that he would do. So the key accusation made against Jesus was that he was a false Messiah. Notice also the lie in the accusation. Jesus never said that he would destroy the temple. Jesus had only said that he would rebuild it in 3 days. This idea of the 3 days went on to become one of the most important motives of the gospel in the New Testament, for on the 3rd day, Jesus rose from the dead. The very thing for which the Jews apparently condemned Jesus was turned into a key sign of his victory. Can you think of an example in your own life in which God has taken one of your apparent weaknesses and turned it into a wonderful strength? As a skilled politician, the high priest Caiaphas knew how to manipulate a situation. During Jesus' trial, he held back and remained silent. The accusations had all been heard, focusing on Jesus' statements about the temple. Through it all, Jesus had remained in silent dignity. The high priest now decides to dramatically intervene.
Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer.
Why did Jesus refuse to answer the high priest? Why did he refuse to respond to the accusations made against him? Well, Jesus refused to recognize the authority of this court. Jesus was also silent because there comes a point when there's nothing more that can be said. Jesus had been teaching publicly for years, and he'd been teaching specifically in the temple, the heart of Jerusalem, during the last week. They had all heard what he had to say, and they had already made their decision. Jesus doesn't play games. Their chance to pull back from the brink had passed. Jesus doesn't speak to those who accuse him. Could it be that in your heart you have accusations against God that are keeping him from speaking to you? Or perhaps you are trying to wrongfully impose your authority over him. What kinds of attitudes does God require from you so that he may reveal truth to you today? During his trial before the high priest Caiaphas, Jesus refuses to answer the many accusations made against him. An infuriated high priest has just stood up and demanded that Jesus answer the charges. And still, Jesus says not a word. Caiaphas, who is used to being in charge, seems to have completely lost control of the situation. So now, Caiaphas intervenes again, and this time, Jesus will respond.
Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death.
Mark says that Caiaphas asks Jesus again. This implies that the high priest is repeatedly asking Jesus about his identity. This time, the high priest asks Jesus a very specific question. He asks Jesus if he is the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, finally, Jesus answers, and when he does, his answer is astounding. The first time he opens his mouth at his trial is to utter the words, "I am," in Greek. It's ego eimi, the sacred name by which the God of the Exodus had identified himself to the Israelites. And then he quotes straight from Daniel chapter 7 and verse 13. Jesus is announcing that he is the divine one who will fulfill the prophecies of Daniel. In this brief exchange, Jesus identified himself not only as their God, but as their Messiah and Savior who would fulfill all prophecy. For anyone other than God himself to say these things was blasphemy. In dramatic scenes, the Sanhedrin condemned him as worthy of death. Have you really understood who Jesus is? When you understand the implications of what Jesus claimed at his trial, It will completely reshape your understanding of the Bible, of prophecy, and of what happened at the cross. The high priest Caiaphas has just asked Jesus directly if he is the Messiah, the Son of God. And for the first time, Jesus has responded. In his response, he has gone way beyond identifying himself as the Messiah. In using the name I am, Jesus has unequivocally identified himself as being Jehovah God. Not only that, but Jesus has identified himself as the divine Son of Man, who defeats his enemies and brings about the kingdom of God in the prophecies of Daniel. Plain truth is often met by pure anger, and that is precisely what happens next.
Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy!" And the guards took him and beat him.
The brutality here is staggering. Consider who the perpetrators are. They are the members of the Sanhedrin themselves, the spiritual leaders and leading theologians of the nation. And amid the violence, it's notable what their main taunt against Jesus is. They continually and mockingly ask him to prophesy. However, he does not. He remains silent. There are many today who ask Jesus to prophesy to them while they spit in his face and strike him with their fists. There are many who ask Jesus to prophesy to them while they have blindfolded him, and they think that Jesus doesn't know what they are doing. The lesson here is striking. You cannot expect the blessing of God when you are manifesting anger, bitterness, and violence in all its forms in your life. It's shocking to be confronted with the violence and evil that often lives in the hearts of the most seemingly pious men and women. The ones who did this were the most respected religious leaders of the people. Do you have a problem with anger in your relationships? If you do, get help fast. Jesus is waiting to help. Peter has just denied knowing Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus said he would. When the reality of who you really are catches up with you, it can be a very sobering moment, and so it was for Peter.
Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and wept.
Peter had already moved away from the fire, and he was at the gate of the courtyard. When he heard the rooster crow the 2nd time, his heart broke and he wept. What he thought was his identity and his entire worldview had been shattered. He was not the man he thought he was, and now he didn't understand anything at all. Now he was ready for God to rebuild his life the way that God had always wanted it to be. Another gospel tells us that in great distress he fled. It's no coincidence that there was also another man in great distress that night because of what he'd done to Jesus, and that was Judas. The difference between the two was that Peter remembered the words of Jesus, but Judas didn't. That's why the outcomes of their lives were so different. Have you ever wept in your relationship with Jesus? Perhaps they were tears of happiness and gratitude as you lost yourself in worship. Perhaps you've wept as you meditated on the cross and realized what Jesus has done for you. Or perhaps you've wept because, like Peter, you've realized that you really are more broken than you ever thought possible. Think about your tears. Tears change things. They changed Peter's life. how have they changed yours? Now that they have their hands on Jesus, his enemies make their plans for how to kill him. Let's see what happens next.
Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin, made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate.
The Sanhedrin stayed up all night, making their evil plans. Although they were the supreme court of the Jews, the Romans had taken away their power to condemn people to death. They reserved that power for themselves, and that's why the Sanhedrin had to think carefully about how they would approach the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. Pilate was in Jerusalem with extra troops to keep order in the city during the Passover. Pilate would not have been happy to have had to get up for this delegation from the Jews with their bound prisoner. Yet, although he didn't know it, this morning he would soon be making the most important decision of his life. The reason the Sanhedrin handed Jesus over to Pilate was because he was the only one with the authority to impose the death penalty. This is the first time that Mark tells us that Jesus was bound. Think about how ridiculous it was for these people to bind Jesus. Now, think about all the ways in which you have bound Jesus in your life. Pray for the power of Jesus to be released in your life through his Holy Spirit. Very early in the morning, Jesus has been handed over bound to Pilate. As the Roman prefect of Judea, Pilate was the only person in the nation with the authority to impose the death penalty. So what Jesus says to him is important. Again, we get to listen in.
"Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of?" But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed.
Mark emphasizes that the Jews accused Jesus of many things. However, the chief accusation they brought before Pilate was that Jesus had called himself a king. This was, of course, true. However, in the eyes of Rome, this was treason and deserved the death penalty. As he had done before the Sanhedrin, Jesus made no reply to Pilate as he repeated the accusations of the Jews against him. Pilate was amazed. He had seen the fury of the chief priests against Jesus and their determination to destroy him. And he had interrogated many rebel Jews before. They would snarl their hatred or rattle off their anti-Roman slogans, but they were never silent. Jesus, however, stood before him meekly and silently, entirely at peace in the midst of the storm around him. Pilate had never seen such a man before. Some people say, if God is real, then I expect him to appear before me or speak to me, and then I'll believe. But Jesus never speaks to justify his existence and his identity. He doesn't have to. His teachings and his deeds announce his presence among us. The Father has already announced his identity from heaven as his beloved Son. To these things, all the prophets bear witness. What more do you need to believe? Pilate was a brutal prefect of Judea. One of his key jobs was to keep the Jews peaceful and quiet, and in this he failed miserably. There were, however, some practices that he supported which aimed to keep the people happy. One of these was the custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover.
Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead.
Pilate was trying to find a way to save Jesus. Terrorists back then were viewed much in the same way as they are viewed today. Barabbas was a murderous terrorist, and Jesus had only taught peace and done good. Pilate mockingly presented Jesus before the crowd, mockingly calling him the King of the Jews. He hoped to highlight the irony between the title and the bruised and battered man who stood meekly and peacefully before them. On the other hand was the angry, snarling terrorist. Surely, Pilate thought, the crowd would choose Jesus over Barabbas. But the chief priests had done their work well and stirred up the crowd so that they cried out for Pilate to release Barabbas to them instead. Barabbas was probably the leader of the murderous terrorist gang who had been captured, and it was probably two men from that same gang who were due to be crucified with Jesus. The Romans were efficient. They crucified men in batches. Because of the choice that was made that morning, Jesus was crucified in the place of Barabbas, and Barabbas walked free. Have you realized that you are Barabbas? Replay the events of that morning in your mind, replacing Barabbas with yourself. What feelings and emotions do you experience as you relive the story? The crowd has just asked Pilate to release Barabbas to them instead of Jesus. This doesn't help Pilate with the problem of what to do with Jesus, and so he asks the crowd,
"What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews?" Pilate asked them.
Pilate is still desperately trying to save Jesus. He is continually throwing the issue back to the people. He doesn't want to deal with it, but he must. And now that the crowd has shockingly chosen Barabbas, Pilate seems well and truly cornered. It's now that Pilate asks the most important question: what shall I do with Jesus? But he asked the wrong people. He asked the crowd, when it's a question that he should have answered only by listening to his conscience and no one else. The other striking thing about this question is that the answer centers on the issues of life or death. This is very black and white. It is either crucify Christ or let him live. A half-hearted answer is not enough. Put yourself in Pilate's shoes. The last thing he needed was a riot during Passover. He needed to keep the Jews happy. His career and reputation were on the line. From a worldly point of view, he had no choice. The crowd will always crucify Jesus. Never rely on the crowd for advice about how to live or how to believe. And you should never ask the crowd what you should do with Jesus. The question Pilate asked is the most important question we will ever face. It's a question that no one who has ever lived can avoid answering. What will be your answer?